Hi, Priya. Nice to see you. And today, our topic of conversation is about leadership and success. And we're going to start with just setting the scene, and then we're going to go into a free flowing conversation. So, obviously, leadership and success often go together. But this quote I particularly like, which is really reminding us that people don't like to be managed. You can manage things, you can manage quotas and procedures and all that, but people are a bit like, I like to think of them as cats. Cats don't like to be herded, and people, especially creative people, do not like to be managed. But at the same time, you do have people who are managers, and I think it'll be helpful for them to think of their role as leading the team rather than managing people. So this is the quote about leadership is doing the right things, and management is about doing things right. And I think that's probably a good place for us to start with thinking about the difference between someone who is leading an organization and someone who may be, in charge of taking that vision and putting it into practice. So what Priya and I want to do is cover these basic points through our conversation. So, what is leadership? Obviously, different people have different definitions of that. What are the different leadership styles? And we're going to refer to one or two of them, and what situations that those might be suitable in. The impact of having a good leader, and can you imagine an organization where there is no leader? There are such organizations, but obviously the dynamics will be quite different. um, Challenges of being a leader, and we all know that being a leader is great. It's associated with success and progression, but it's not always easy. And finally, we're going to share some of our own personal experiences of either being in the presence of great leaders, or indeed having had that experience in some other way. So I'm going to stop share now. So Priya, tell me, what is your take on leadership? Because you've worked, in many different organizations, and you've experienced lots of different kinds of leadership. How would you define it?
Yeah. I've been thinking about this topic, and it occurs to me that there's a couple of different things. One is positional leadership, right? Where you're appointed to be the leader at a particular role. It could be CEO, CXO, whatever, team leader, etc. And then there's leadership that comes through in terms of behavior and actions taken. So I think those two things are very different, and very often we see one and not the other. And finding both together in the same person is actually relatively rare.
Yeah.
So while most organizations do talk about a leadership team, what they're really talking about is a top management team, whose job is to manage. And very few of them luck out by finding leaders. And when they do, I think that's when you see organizations sort of flourishing and thriving.
Yes, yes. I really like that. And I think you're so right, because it just tells us that we all as individuals have the opportunity to be leaders in our own life, in the way we take decisions, in the way we make choices, and in the way we take ownership of, our little piece of the world. So I suppose the next question was about, what are the different kinds of leadership? And you mentioned, situational I think that's what the word you
Yeah,
used,
yeah,
wasn't it? That you get appointed in a certain role, and to some extent, the job you have to do has already been decided for you. So you may
yeah.
not have a huge amount of freedom to come in and put your own spin on it. Depends on obviously the organization. So what do you think? Somebody who's been appointed to that kind of role, what should they think about the kind of leadership they need to bring into their role?
So there's some very different things that they need to think about. Like obviously on the business side, there's the whole strategic angle of what's the best strategy for this business to follow. They can get experts to weigh in, but ultimately a leader has to take the call, and he or she has to have a vision for the direction in which they could move their company, or the direction in which the industry is moving, and therefore how should the company orientate itself. And sometimes I see that, at least in the corporate sector, there are many companies where that kind of vision thing doesn't really happen.
Mm.
And so, then it's really all about, okay, how do I drive up profits, right? Or reduce my costs. And, of course, we have any number of consultants who will come and tell you, okay, chop off this section of people or that and whatever. But I don't know if that makes for leadership. That's again what I call a managerial role as
Yeah.
a leader, right? Whereas for a leader to actually take a call and say, okay, here's how I'm going to reshape my industry, or this is the way that we're going to pivot as a company and relook at what we are doing, right? Or we're going to start doing things differently. I think so. To my mind, always there's an element of innovation and challenging the status quo that comes in as critical to the role of the leader. So that's on the business side. Now, on the other side is the organizational role as a leader, which is all about managing people, managing teams, empowering your people, helping them, inspiring them to go above and beyond what they thought they were capable of, right? Playing to their strengths, getting over their weaknesses, all of that, the softer side of things as it's called, but it's not really softer because you can't, if you, as a ship, you can't say, I want to find the new world and then have all your rowers rowing in different directions. You'll go
Yeah.
around in circles.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about how important it is for somebody who's looking for a leadership role to understand the organizational culture. So, for example, we were talking about this before that somebody who's a military leader is very different to somebody who's leading, say, a technology or a social media company or something like that, because the discipline required in a military leader or in a military is very different to the creative freedom required in a sort of a tech company. So I think
Yeah, yeah.
I would say Daniel Goleman's the Six Leadership Styles is a really good read for anyone who's interested. And some of the leadership styles he talks about, one is obviously the coercive leadership, where it's your military style leadership, where this is what I'm telling you
Mhm.
to do, just do it, don't question, don't think, just do. And that's almost like treating them like machines, like you have a job to do, just do it. On
Yeah,
the other
yeah,
hand, you have a coaching style leader who's the kind you talked about, who actually empowers their people, who nurtures talent and is not threatened by somebody maybe even surpassing them in terms of skills and abilities. I mean, from your experience, I know we're jumping around the topics a bit. Do you recall a really great leader? What's been your experience of leadership?
so there's one bizarre thing is that as I was thinking about the topic, I realized that a lot of how I model myself as a leader when I came to that level was from people that I didn't want to be like, behaviors that I did not want to follow. But
Yeah.
at the same time, there were some really great leaders. And it's interesting. So there were, and I don't know if it's reflective of things in general or it just so happened, but two of my bosses who were both female, they had a terrific ability, they had a terrific EQ, and their ability to make diverse people from the team come together, make the team come together as a single unit, was just unparalleled. I mean, I've never seen it anywhere, and that's something that I always thought was so fabulous. They were just amazing at getting everybody almost to become friends with each other, right? So you would start looking forward to going to work and hanging out with your colleagues every day. The work culture that they created for the unit they were heading, in fact, in many ways it was different from the work culture of the overall organization. So it was a much more warmer, fun, nourishing kind of environment, and we thrived as a business, because everybody just loved to come to work. Even today,
Yeah.
one of the situations we talk about, that was the most fun stint at work that all of us had. All of us are friends like 25 years later, and we had so much stability, like hardly anybody left the unit for like a period of almost 10 years.
And that makes so much sense because there's a statistic or there's a study that shows that a happy employee is on average 25% more productive than an unhappy one.
Wow.
I mean, that is
So
huge. That's an
yeah.
average. So in some industries which are very, client facing or sales orientated, that number could be as high as 75%. And it
Wow.
makes sense. When you're happy, you're going to go and you're going to have a certain vibe and your clients are going to notice it, your colleagues will notice it. So it's a hugely powerful economic indicator of, success if you have
Yeah.
happy employees. Just
Yeah.
on
So
that, Priya,
uh,
sorry, go
sorry.
on.
So one of my friends, he's a professor at UT Austin, Raj Raghunathan, and he studies the field of happiness, right? So he's written about it, saying if you're so smart, why aren't you happy? And one of the interesting things that he talks about in his book and in his online course is that, happy people are successful. It's not that success leads to happiness, it's the other way around. So
Yes.
this kind of falls in line with that.
Yeah, and I think Richard Branson, who's the founder of Virgin, he wrote this beautiful letter, which is somewhat on those lines. And if I can find it, I will also post it in the links. So you mentioned EQ as a powerful way to nurture and create that happiness. I had a question. Was your team that was led by a woman? Was it a predominantly female, or was it mixed?
No, no, it was, in one case it was mixed. In the other case, it so happened that everybody who was at the next level down of leadership, all of us were women. But it just so happened. And then, below that, it was a mixed team. But there was another leader that I recall who was actually very good at driving all of us and, making us sort of do really well. And his whole thing was to challenge whatever we said. So again, he was very friendly, but I wouldn't say he had high EQ, you know, but he was not a, harsh taskmaster in that sense. He would just challenge everything that you said. So you were always trying to be one jump ahead of him.
Yeah.
And the outcome was that we all were like two steps ahead of the market.
Yes. That's interesting. So it's combining all these different aspects and actually making it
Yeah.
fit the kind of organization. And the other point you made, which I thought was interesting, is that you said the culture within your small team that was led by this woman was a bit different to the overall organizational culture, which
Yeah.
which leads me to believe that we as leaders, we mustn't always feel that we need to fit in with what everyone else is doing, that there is room to create
Yeah.
something special and
Yeah.
better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. I think that's very important actually. And work culture is one of the biggest things that a leader can do, right? They set the tone. I mean, it's very well expecting, people to kind of make their own work culture, but it happens only at after you reach a certain level, in my opinion, that you can start doing that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the things that is probably quite important to talk about is that the leader will also decide on the complexion and the team, who is in that team. So what was your kind of experience of how did leaders pick teams well? Good leaders, how did they pick teams?
So it was interesting. I would say in two or three of the cases, it's almost like the leaders were given a team of, bright young people, and then they molded team dynamics so that it all worked very well. And there were some, I would say, sort of obvious standouts who didn't quite fit in with the other members of the team. So I would say that today those guys are not part of the close knit friend circle from that organization. But at the time that they were part of the team, they worked really well. They kind of broadly fitted in with the group dynamic, and they did well. And the organization, I mean, they did well for themselves and the organization at the time. But so it's not always about, I think, what you're about who you hire as a leader. You don't always get a choice, but it's
True.
about, it's kind of like the MasterChef mystery box. You get the mystery ingredients, and it's up to you whether you turn out a great dish or it just goes all haywire.
That's such a great example. Yeah, you're right. Because, if you're a startup and you're just starting out, then, you get to pick. But even
Yeah.
startups struggle because they
Yeah.
don't always know how to pick a really good team. So if somebody here is a startup and is, leading, um, is looking to lead a really vibrant team, I think some of the things that I've learned that they need to do is one is to really think about the complementary nature of teams, that don't look for people who are just like you or mini versions of you, because that doesn't work. So you actually want people in some ways who are better than you on certain things, because you don't want to be the person who knows everything or the person who's going to have answers to every single question, but really be secure enough in your own knowledge and your own skills to pick people in some ways who are better than you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's critical. And now that I'm thinking about it, a couple of examples come to mind. I'm not going to name the organizations, but where they sort of made where they had a problem with the person they'd hired to be the leader. because the person had great credentials, great track record, but that organizational fit maybe was a little off. And so it never quite worked out. And then it's really hard because you made this commitment of hiring somebody at a leadership level, and then it's hard to walk it back.
That's such a
uh,
good example, because I experienced this in my working life. I spent 20 years in wealth management, and we used to have people brought in because it's they optically were brilliant, and they were really really good at what they did, and so you bring them in, and of course they were probably really good at what they did in the organization that they were in. But if they didn't come into the new organization and take the trouble to understand the dynamics of that particular organization, then however good they were in the previous one, chances are they wouldn't necessarily be as good.
yeah,
Because you yeah, people don't respect you automatically just because you were really good at something else. That you
yeah.
have to earn that respect, even
I
as a
love that
leader.
optically perfect as a phrase. It's perfect.
Yeah. So, what are the challenges then of being a leader? Because people might think, oh, these leaders, they get paid so much, fantastic, status, etc. But we both know that it's not always easy. So, what is your experience of the challenges?
So I think honestly, the biggest challenge is always to get the team together and work with different kinds of energy. So a couple of times I've had people in the team where I was hired from outside, and there was somebody in the team who expected to be made leader, and so they received a rude shock, and then it became like a clash of personalities. So managing that, not letting it lead to politics within the team, and so I think in some ways that was one big thing. Then in a turnaround situation that I handled, I think the biggest thing was to give the team, like the team had this, not the team, but the unit had like not a very great reputation in the market. We weren't doing very well as a result. So everybody was just doing their pieces of work, but there was no, and there was a revenue target, but there was no vision as to what we wanted to become. So I think the difficult thing there for me was to just grapple with identifying a vision and then getting everybody to adopt that vision,
Yes.
and make it part of the way that they saw themselves. So, as always, it's usually the people problems, and you sort out the people problems, your business kind of, sorts itself out, I feel.
Yeah.
But, Rohini, you would have seen a lot of people in your career as a coach. So you would, I think, have a ringside view on what are some of the challenges that leaders come to you with and want you to sort out for them.
Yeah, so I've worked with people at different levels of leadership, So I would say for someone who's looking to go into a new leadership role, maybe they're looking to, go from being a really good, strong individual contributor to maybe taking on a leadership role. And I think the challenge for those people sometimes can be is that they were really, really good at what they did, but that doesn't automatically mean that they will be really good at leading a team of people and getting them to become really strong individual contributors. So sometimes there's a dissonance between what they think that their job is going to involve and what it actually involves. Because suddenly, their performance targets are not for their individual performance, it's for the team's performance. And they may become micromanagers, because they think, well, I did this really well, this is how it should be done. And they might then find that suddenly that when people are not doing it the way they do it, they feel uncomfortable, they feel like it's their job to tell them how to do stuff, which could be a mistake, because we talked about the coercive leader and the coaching style leader.
Yeah.
So that's one of the challenges, and I always say to people, don't feel that that is the only way you can be successful, by taking that promotion, which means that you become head of
Yeah.
sales or head of whatever, because it may not suit you. The
Yeah.
other thing I think that people often struggle with, and this is both men and women, is the communication aspect. And you said it beautifully earlier, that sometimes you can have a top down vision of what the company wants to achieve. But very often that vision is very kind of, business schooly, and it's full of jargon, and it's really there for, PR purposes. But how often does a company actually, you know, live that vision internally? How much do the people on the ground believe in that vision? So I think when there's a mismatch between what the world thinks you stand for and what you actually stand for, it can create some real confusion. And it's all about communication, because um, some mistakes happen because leaders are very focused on how they're communicating to the outside world, and they forget to communicate to their internal stakeholders, who are their employees. And I had this friend of mine who always said that there are internal customers and there's external customers. Your
Yeah,
external customers are the ones who create your revenues. Your internal customers are obviously your employees, and you mustn't forget that they are just as important, if not even more important. So I think those are the challenges. But also, I think, when you get to the top level, it's very lonely. Leadership is lonely. People are not automatically going to feel sympathetic towards you when things go wrong. And that can be tough.
yeah,
So you
yeah,
have to be willing to take responsibility when things go wrong. But when things go well, equally, you need to be willing to share the praise and the credit, and that's not always easy. So I
yeah,
think those are the
yeah,
main challenges that I've come across.
yeah. So, what do you think are some of the sort of impacts of a good or a bad leader on an organization? So, what difference can that make?
So I think that we talked about the happiness and the importance of a happy environment. So if you have a really good leader who has a vision that he can enlist his or her people into, that's very powerful. And how you communicate on an ongoing basis, how you get feedback from people, how you take that feedback in the right way and make the necessary changes, all those will create greater engagement, greater happiness, which then translates into greater productivity, i.e., greater sales. But also, it helps to minimize costs because you know how disruptive it is when somebody who you've had for years leaves the organization. Then you've got to recruit someone, train them. Also, sickness, absenteeism because people are
Yeah,
unhappy or demotivated. These are real costs. So you put it all together in a P&L, and you can see how a badly run organization compared to a really well one, night and day in terms of
yeah, yeah.
performance. So I'm
So,
conscious that we have probably only another minute or so, Priya, because this is
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah.
We can talk for ages.
So I just wanted to ask a question specifically for Wim that, do you find a difference in the kind of questions that women leaders come to you with vis-a-vis male leaders?
So I think women leaders will often come in with perhaps much more EQ, which is great. But when it's directed inwards, they're probably asking lots of themselves, much more than maybe the men will, So
Hmm.
so in that, maybe we talked about this, about the imposter syndrome. Men also have it, but men are probably better at disguising it and just getting on with it. And optically they look much more
You're so
confident.
nice in here, mom.
Even though inside they might be struggling with the same issues. But I think also women tend to read between the lines a lot more. They probably read into things that weren't even there, so they can
Hmm.
become in a way their own worst critics and beat themselves up for things that probably were not even their fault. But other than that, I think the challenges are very similar, but it's how they deal with it, how they actually put pressure on themselves can be a bit different.
And I think net, you and I have kind of, in our short conversation, decided that EQ is actually one of the biggest indicators of leadership, and it's one of the most important qualities required of a leader. So hopefully, in that sense, women have a leg up as long as they use it
Definitely.
well.
But I think, but coming back to what we talked about earlier about the different situations. So, if you're in a turnaround situation and you're firefighting, then EQ doesn't have as much place. So if you're a fireman and you're leading a fire team, you just like military,
Yeah,
you just
yeah,
get on with it, and you need to have that conviction that you know exactly what needs to be done. You're not going to worry about somebody's feelings and all that. You just get
yeah.
it done. But on a
Which,
different situation, so I
yeah,
think, be mindful of the kind of organization and the kind of role.
yeah. And I think which also brings me to I mean, the situations you described also brings me to the other thought that I had, which is that, you need to be good at different kinds of leadership styles because different situations in the same company could ask for a different style. You can't be coaching somebody if there's an earthquake in the building. I mean,
Yeah,
you can't be like coaching them to leave the building. You got to be
exactly.
very martial about it.
That's exactly right. And I think, but it's a lot to ask for people to be good at all of that. And that's where the
Sure.
self-awareness comes in, and if you realize that, this is just not my thing, which is why very often, you get a certain kind of leader coming in a turnaround phase. But when that turnaround phase is past and it's a more steady state phase, CEO will change and you get
Yeah.
somebody else. Because the turnaround guy loves that firefighting,
Yeah.
loves that adrenaline
Yeah.
of pulling something out of the rubble. And he's going to be bored. He keep saying he. Sorry, I don't mean to.
Yeah.
I'm not meaning that
Yeah.
women can't do that, but they are going to be bored with a steady state kind of thing, which probably requires more of a coaching style
Yeah.
leader.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I'm sorry we've gone a little bit over our time, but hopefully you found this useful. Thank you so much, Priya.
Thanks, Rohini.